he told me that I should look in the Guardian for media jobs, which I did. And the very first day I looked was this job that said wanted, writer in residence of a high security male prison. And each one of those words filled me with total dread. I was really, really scared. I had never in my life been inside a prison. I have a couple of friends who were prison visitors, and I'd never really understood why they'd want to do it. I consider myself a fairly law-abiding person. The worst I'd ever done was park on a double yellow line, for which I got caught, as we said. So when I went for the interview, I rather hoped that I wouldn't get it. And I totally messed up the interview because the governor said to me, what would I do if an officer came in and said, right, there's an emergency, everyone out. And I said, do come in, you're very welcome to come in here. And I said, well, I'd get people to finish their sentence and then start the first half of the next sentence, because it's much easier to continue if you've written half a sentence. It's a writing tip that I can pass on. And he said, right, and by that time, half the prison would have escaped. So I thought, well, I've blown it. And because I thought I'd blown it, I relaxed. And I think that helped me get the job. Now, as I said, I've never thought of writing crime, but I've never been inside a prison before. And when I went for my interview, apart from having, I thought I messed up the verbal part, they took me inside to talk to some of the men. And this very, very frightening looking man came up to me, and he was the kind of person that if you weren't familiar with prisons, you might think was a typical criminal. So he had lots of tattoos. He had a very, mind you, my youngest has lots of tattoos, but anyway, he had a really big, he was a big man, and he looked very frightening, I have to say. And he came very, very close up to me. So his face was about that much away. And he said, what are you doing here? And I kind of was too taken aback to even take a step backwards. But it reinforced my feeling that I actually did not want this job. I was very scared, as I said, to go through to the prison. You go through something that looks like this, you go through several doors, you're frisked, you can only take certain things in because many things are considered dangerous. Even sugar, little packets of sugar can be used to make hooch, which is an illicit drink. And I thought, this is not for me. And I was totally and utterly horrified when they rang that night and said, would you like the job? So, as I said, I did it really because I needed the money. Perfectly open about that. But I found, almost as soon as I went, within that first day, that I was completely and utterly hooked. This was a world, as I said, that I had never come across before. Prison is a hotbed of emotions. And at the prison, there were new and old buildings. And in fact, I worked in the open prison in the morning. And then in the afternoon, I would go through, this isn't the prison that I worked at, but it's very, very similar. I would go through that door there, you can see there. I'd be frisked, as I said, being asked what I was carrying. I was allowed to bring my laptop in, provided it wasn't linked to the internet. And I was then given carte blanche. I was allowed to do what I wanted in terms of getting men to my workshops. Because I wasn't part of the education team where people had to come to lessons. I was a sort of literary Pied Piper, whereby people had to be given permission by the other men on their wing to come to my classes. But they didn't have to come, so I needed to encourage them to come. And I would make up flyers telling them what I did, which was helping to run novel workshops, short story workshops, life story workshops, letters home. There was an enormous range of writing skills in prison. People think that prisons are illiterate. That's just not always the case. There was some amazing talent in prison. And as I said, I was also working at Oxford, and on one particular day I would go straight from the prison to Oxford University. And I can honestly say that the standard of writing skills was very similar. I had some men who wrote some marvellous poetry and could tell a very good tale. So this is a modern prison. It's not like the one that I was in. I say could it be inspiration for a love story inside? My husband's wife does tell a love story, but it also talks about domestic relationships being stretched to the limit. I think probably one of the most frightening things that happened to me was on day one, and I went for what was called my key talk, where they talked me through the responsibility of having keys around my waist. I couldn't actually believe it when after half an hour I was given the key to the prison. That was a scary thing actually. And I was the kind of person at the time who would have to go back to my own front door and check I'd locked it a few times. And this cured me because I knew that if I did that every time I went through one of the doors of the prison, I'd never get out. It would take me ages because there were so many keys so many doors to be unlocked. And during my key talk, I was asked if I was single, and I soon discovered that actually there were quite a lot of relationships that were formed in prisons, again, which gave me ideas for my husband's wife. Prison is divided into wards, or they said to me, I knew that if I said no, I don't want to do that, I'd lose their trust. But I also knew that if I did do it, and something awful happened, I would be blamed. And that you can see the headlines, can't you, naive writer, etc., etc. And I did it, and it was fine. But I have to say that I was slightly worried because I was in a room on my own with rapists, murderers, and people who committed previous bodily harm, and I was way away from anyone. But my men, I think, had a great loyalty towards me, and I like to think it's because they were really interested in writing. And I entered many of their poems and short stories for something called the Kessler Awards, which are awards given to men and women in prison, and many of them won prizes. And this was really why I'd been asked to do the job, because I'd been employed by the Writers in Prison Network, which was funded by the Arts Council. And the reason behind it is that it's been proved that there is a lower risk of reoffending if men have their self-esteem increased. And we all know what it's like, don't we? If somebody says we're no good, we kind of think, well, what's the point in trying? But if somebody says, actually, that's good, and have you thought of doing such and such as well, then you feel better about yourself, and you're more likely to perhaps carry on and do things the right way. So that's why I said I didn't see men in their cells. I wasn't allowed to do that, and we held workshops in the communal area. But one day, and then just go back to that, that was the story I just told you about going upstairs. I did a lot of one-to-ones where there weren't groups, where it was just one man in front of me. And life stories were a very popular thing to write. And some of my men couldn't write, so they would say their life story out loud, and I would write it down. And one story that I'll never forget was a man who told me how his father would come into his bedroom when he was a child and borrow his Spider-Man mask and then go out to commit crimes with it. So this man grew up in a household where crime was considered to be a career. And when he got older, about 11, he started stealing cars, and then he started robbing post offices and doing various other things like that. And he told me a story which distressed me so much that it actually made me cry. And then I thought, well, I've done that. That's terrible. I really shouldn't have done this. I shouldn't have shown my emotion. And when I came back the next day, he said, you know, Jane, because you cried, it made me think again, and I feel really ashamed of what I did. So it does show that writing about things can make people think about what they've done. Now, this is actually quite important for my book because there is a romantic frisson between staff. You did have romances between officers. And you also got some prisoners who would try to, quote, groom members of staff. In other words, they would try and flatter them, to try and get them on sides where they might ask favours. Now, in My Husband's Wife, the story starts with a young married couple in the year 2000, and the girl is a lawyer who is asked to handle a murderer's appeal. And when she goes into prison, she finds herself attracted in an intellectual way to this murderer, who then puts her through various tests to see if she's up to the job. And as the book develops, a relationship of a less platonic nature does develop between the lawyer and the criminal, which I won't go into because I want to read the book. Now, as I said, not all prisoners look like the archetypal thug. I mean, this is somebody who might seem quite frightening, but some of them literally look like your next door neighbour, somebody that you might know well, a member of your family. So it's as I said, men can be there for some very bad reasons, but they don't necessarily have to look like the kind of prisoner that you might have in your mind. And one thing that I learned was that many crimes were being committed when men had drunk too much or been on drugs. And one of our governors, because there was the chief governor and other governors too, actually asked a man that I was helping to become a journalist when I was in prison to go and give talks to schools and talk to them about the dangers of drugs. Letters from home were really, really important. Men would queue up for their post at a window, and they would get very upset, understandably, if they didn't get letters. I would help men write letters home if they couldn't write. And I also helped with a project called Storybook Dads, where I helped men to write a story for their own children. And we'd put their names in it and we would record it. I would have to go through lots of security channels, but if the mothers approved, it would then be sent home. And then the children would be able to hear their father's voice recorded, reading a story. So it's really, as you can see from that picture there, it's heartbreaking. Separation from a child is really heartbreaking. And there were some things called family days in prison, which really surprised me because, as I said, I had no idea how prisons operated before. Family days were when girlfriends came along, wives, and many of my men invited me to meet them. What's a girl do on a Saturday night? This refers to a very scary moment in my life when the governor said, would I like to spend the night in prison? And I thought, no, I don't want to spend the night in prison, thank you very much. But it was for a charity drive, and it would be very difficult to have turned it down, so I did. And I found it the most claustrophobic, scary night I've ever spent. I had to sit on a chair when I went in, which would photograph my insides to show if I was carrying drugs. But the scariest bit was when it was lock-up time, and I'd be in a room, all on my own, and unable to ring my husband, because I'd married again by then, unable to ring my husband, unable to ring my children, and it gave you a taste of what it was like, and it made me think that I actually never wanted to cross paths with the law. So men literally obviously would count down the days to their release, but what happens to a relationship when a prisoner is released? It's very tough. Many men find they don't have money, they don't have a job, and then they perhaps might commit a crime again, and back they go. And again, this is all explored in My Husband's Wife, and that first kiss can be very awkward. Quite often I would arrive at a prison in the morning, because it started very early, and I would see a man waiting for someone to pick him up, because men are released very early in the morning. Prison starts about 6 o'clock, and sometimes I'd go back from my coffee break to the car and find that man still waiting, and you know that his family had not picked him up, which can be very difficult. One thing I hadn't appreciated was that even after someone's released from prison, it's hard to rent a flat, get insurance, find a job. Many couples split up, and in fact, if you, I believe this is true, that if you have a prisoner, somebody who has committed a crime in your house, your insurance might not be valid. I wrote a story for a magazine about it, and they did these cartoons, which actually I was a bit worried about, because that looks like, as I said, the kind of criminal you might think about, but in fact they don't all look like that. But what is important is that many men write, and as I said before, there's a lot of skill there. And one day I came along to work and found that the prison was very quiet, and there was this awful hushed air, and I found out that actually one man had murdered another, which was really terrible, because both men had been murderers anyway, and you find your emotions being tested, because here's one murderer who's murdered another. Who do you feel sorry for? Should you feel sorry for them? It just makes you think. Another day I came in, and there was a man who was one of my best poets. He hadn't been able to read or write until 7 years earlier. One of the prison officers had taught him to read or write, which was a marvellous thing for a prison officer to do. You quite often hear bad things about prison officers, but actually this man had taken the patience to teach this man how to read and write. And he wrote the most amazing poetry in the most beautiful handwriting I've ever seen. And he wasn't there. And I asked the prison officer why he wasn't there. And he said, well, so-and-so has been shipped out. Now, shipped out, I've learned, was prison talk for being moved overnight to cause minimal disruption, and normally for a pretty bad crime. I hope you've all had dinner. I'm about to say what your dinner. He'd been allowed a budgerigar as a pet, and he put budgerigar poo in the ice cream because he worked in the kitchen. And that kind of thing happens. Some pretty grim stuff does happen in prison. And it makes you think. And when I would leave prison in the evening, I'd find myself driving about looking at ordinary people in the street thinking, you know, I've been in another world, and people outside don't know what it's like. And maybe if they had a taster in prison, it might reduce the offending rate. So my husband's wife, I said it's to be published, it's just out now. As I said, it tells the story about this young couple and how the lawyer's relationship with the prisoner develops. It also reads in the story of the second wife who you meet. Now, I'm not going to spoil the plot. It tells the story of the second wife, and it's very much about that interaction between marriage, love, and prison, and also what happens if the second wife has to ask the first wife a very big favour. So I'm going to move on now about some advice on how a novel actually gets structured and how I write a book. Can you tell me, anyone, is anyone interested in writing a novel? Can you? Brilliant. Okay, so this I think might be used to you. Can you just show me, Lena, how I just go on to the second PowerPoint? That's it. Okay, great. Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. Okay. So, how to write a bestseller? Okay. So, this is roughly my background. So I did character's name at the top. So again, each of these people have their own life, but they're involved, they're all part of a family, but they could be part of a reunion group, or they could be strangers who've got together. So looking at pictures can be a very good way of deciding what you're going to do with your characters. And I actually always have a cork board with pictures that help me imagine my characters. As I said, I bring in warm characters who find themselves in sticky situations. I say warm characters. The characters in my book, in My Husband's Wife, aren't all warm. You might find yourself wondering who you like and why, and whether you like them at all. Because one of the points I wanted to make in the book is that none of us are all good or all bad. There are actually various degrees of grey in us. Dialogue is very, very important in a novel, and in short stories, and often in poetry too. So you need to get people speaking to each other. That makes the story zing along, and it makes you feel that you're there. So this is somebody I know, the writer Faye Weldon. So if you were writing dialogue, you might, between two characters, you might forget that that's a famous author on the left, and you might think, what's she saying? And then you might think, what am I thinking there? So to write dialogue, it is very useful to listen to what people say, but also to think about, now what could I put in that dialogue that actually makes the plot work? So for example, you might say in your dialogue, you might give a little clue. You might say, when I was in the prison last Thursday, and actually the reader knows that this person who works in the prison on a Wednesday, so you might wonder what they're actually doing on a Thursday. So the dialogue needs to play games with the reader's mind and give them clues. Very important to create a vivid setting so the reader feels that they're next to their characters. I actually tend to do that quite lightly at the beginning, and then I add to the setting later on once I've got the story out. For me, it's very important to get the story out. And I don't sit down and plan the story from beginning to end. I did start doing that at first, but then for me, I found it worked better to write that first chapter about a character, to give them a problem, put them in a difficult situation, and then see what happens to them. So it's almost like reading a book, but you're writing it. I do have lots and lots of notes in my notebook. I have an idea perhaps of where it's going, but it's not set in stone. The reason for that is that I need to let my characters develop. When you meet someone for the first time, you don't know them, do you? It takes time to get to know them. And that's why, as I said, a writer needs space to let that character develop. And then when I finished it, I would go back and revise the whole thing and add more points and more clues about where it's going. So this is again sort of setting, feeling the sea stones on your feet, smelling the air, being waves splashing against you. Going back to plot, I think it's very useful to have a series of problems for each character, but also in each chapter to make sure that something big happens. Has anyone read a book and felt that it was rather boring, that nothing happened? Yeah? That's because perhaps the author hasn't put a big event into a chapter. You need something that keeps people on their toes, that makes them want to turn the page. Something's got to happen. So here's an idea. We've got a load of people in deck chairs, and suddenly one particular deck chair was empty. So what might have happened? Again, going back to that continual question that writers need to ask, what if, or supposing. I like to build up a series of twists with a very big one at the end that takes people by surprise. Maybe somebody turning up at the end to reveal all. This is actually a picture of a man who took me on a walking tour around the Isles of Scilly Isles a few years ago. He had wonderful stories to tell, but one way perhaps of making that final twist come at the end of your novel was for somebody important to turn up at the end, or somebody perhaps you haven't introduced the reader to, who's going to tell you something that you didn't know. Now, I'm a great believer in revision. I think this is actually where many writers perhaps take a little bit of time to get published. When I first started trying to get published, I didn't revise enough. I thought it was just a matter of going through my manuscript, making sure the page numbers were in, that there weren't any typos, and reading it. I now go through it many, many times. I look at the plot, and I make sure that the plot works. I look at each character, and I add more to each. And I sow seeds. And that's actually very important, because, and I put seeds because actually that's what it's like when you have a twist at the end and somebody thinks, how can you make sure, how did that happen? Could that really have happened? As a writer, you need to go back and put little tiny clues in to show. And again, I can't really give you any examples, I don't want to give the plot away. Reading out aloud is a really helpful thing for a writer to do. When I start my chapter, and I tend to write a chapter a day when I'm writing a novel, I always read the previous chapter out to myself, preferably out loud. It helps you understand if you've got the rhythm right. And the same with poetry, same with short stories. Hearing your own voice saying it is vital. And I also do something called a tree diagram. I draw a branch going down which will sum up the chapter, and then I'll do branches, which is a bit like a mind map. Each branch on each branch I will write what I put in each chapter. And that will help me see if I've got the right pace, and it will help me check that something is actually happening. And as I said, once it's finished, I do think very carefully about my plot and about my characters. And then if you're starting off from scratch, what normally happens is you send the first few chapters to an agent who You will then, it's very difficult to get an agent to take you on, but it does happen, and then the agent will then send your novel to the publisher. Now, some publishers actually have what's called an open week. And this is a very useful thing to know, not many people know about it. If you Google publishers' open submissions, you will come up with a list of publishers and times when they will open their doors to manuscripts that have not been taken on by an agent, and that can be a very good way of getting someone to take you on. Another thing that I would really suggest is go to literary festivals and events where there are novelists, where there are agents, and where there are publishers. Some of these festivals you can book one-to-ones with agents and publishers, and I know people who've been published that way and got a deal. I helped to run a publishing festival in Devon called the Sidmouth Literary Festival, and you can get hold of me through Lena. I'm happy for her to give out my email address, or there are some cards as well on the table. And we run a How to Get Published Day. The next one is in June. And it can be it's a very useful way of meeting people and cutting out the middle person. I also recommend a magazine called Writing Magazine, which gives details of new agents and new publishers and competitions. I'm a great believer in entering competitions for poetry and for unpublished books. It helps you, it gives you a goal to write for, and it can give you ideas. The subject matter itself can give you ideas. It provides a discipline. People, or I certainly thought when I got my book deal, didn't go straight into the bookshop, but in fact, the publisher has to sell the book to the bookshops. They have to literally sell it just as you had to sell it to them. And it's quite an ordeal. It's quite a tough thing to do to get into that bookshop, but it is a wonderful thing when you go into a bookshop and you see your name there and your book. There's nothing quite like it. And as Dina said, I was lucky enough to find myself on the Sunday Times chart last Sunday, number 5, which was really, really exciting for me, and probably one of the big highlights of my life. So I'm really happy to take questions on the floor, or if Nina wants to ask me questions.